So if you're just joining us this morning, you're coming into kind of the tail end of a series that we've been doing over the last 12 weeks or so. It's called Rediscovering the Bible. And the aim behind this has been trying to look at the Bible and figure out ways to read it that will kind of help us connect with the way that it was written to be read and understood in the first place. And the last few weeks, we've talked about how different types of literature were actually used to write the Bible. Much of the Bible was written really over about 3,500 years ago was when the Bible started to be written. So a lot of this literature is fairly ancient, and so if we're trying to read it like the latest fiction novel off the shelf, we're going to miss out on a lot of key components. And so we've been looking at how the Bible was written and how we can read it in light of the way that it was written, the different types of literature that were involved. And so one thing, obviously, are narratives or stories. And this is what you probably are familiar with. No matter how familiar you've been with the Bible throughout your life, you've probably heard a Bible story here and there. But oftentimes the Bible stories pieces are left out, and there's components. And these stories, they're made up of different scenes, and each scene fits into the story. And if you don't understand what the big picture is, sometimes you can misunderstand the scene. So we talked about that. We also talked about poetry, because a third of the Bible is ancient poetry. And there's some specific things to look for in the styles of poetry that we use in the Bible that really make things like the book of Psalms come alive, become a lot more personal and understandable. And the last week, and then today, we'll finish up with this. We've looked at what I'm going to call speeches, but it's types of literature that were conveyed more in a logical style of explanation. Last week, we looked at the laws in the Bible, and specifically in the Old Testament. There's like 611 laws in the Old Testament of the Bible. And last week, we talked about how laws, like the rest of the types of speeches, they're taking you through kind of some logical thoughts, but specifically with the laws, they're illustrating deeper principles at work. And so each law is an illustration of how this much deeper principle, like maybe loving your neighbor or something, would work. But it's not necessarily a law as we think of them, some rule to be followed in all cases, in all places, for all time. Which, if you read many of the Old Testament laws, you realize it's impossible to apply them today because they're written toward Israel, ancient Israel, maybe 1,000 years or more before the time of Jesus. And so trying to apply those things directly today, it becomes very confusing. But there's underlying principles, and we talked about ways to understand kind of 4 buckets that those laws go into that help us discern some principles that we can use as we live our life today. So if you want any information about what we've talked about in the past, it's online on our YouTube channel, which is Mountain View Bible Church, Utah. You can look that up there, or next week is family camp, so we won't be meeting here. But in 2 weeks from today, on July 28th, we're just going to do a recap over everything, and I'll have a handout with you with some of the most important kind of pieces of information to help you as you approach the Bible and read it for yourself, just a recap of that as we close out the series on the 28th. And so that's what we talked about last week. This morning, we're looking at the last couple of types of speeches in the Bible and their lectures. Some of it maybe comes across better as a lecture, a sermon that someone's teaching. Think of it in that light. And specifically letters, because most of the New Testament are letters that are specifically the Apostle Paul and some of Jesus' other apostles like John and Peter specifically and James. They're responding to different groups of Christians, certain places, namely in the Roman Empire, by writing letters. Letters are especially tricky because, as you know, I guess now emails are more prevalent than letters, right? But if you've received letters, you're only getting one side of the story, right? You're reading half of someone's mail, and you have to kind of recreate the other part of that. So it makes reading much in the New Testament a little bit tricky. So we'll look at how to approach that as we try to discover what's in the Bible a little bit this morning. But first of all, whether you're reading these speeches, these lectures, think of them as sermons in the New Testament specifically, or these different letters which make up much of the New Testament, there are a few in the Old Testament, but most of it's carried forward in the New Testament with people like the Apostle Paul, Peter, and John. We're going to look at different layers of context because right now you live in 21st century America, and try as though you may to approach the Bible as somebody in 21st century America is really challenging because most of the people that are being written to in the Bible, most of these Christians in this case in the early New Testament, They're not living in 21st century America. They're living in the Roman Empire, which is a totally different world and a totally different culture. So we're just going to get some insights on different types of context or layers to look for as we read specifically things in the New Testament today. Again, just to give us a better idea of how to approach the Bible and rediscover it, not from our perspective, but from the perspective in which it was written. So with that, we'll step into the first layer, and that's biblical context. It's what we've talked about all along, and that is that if you read lectures in the New Testament of the Bible or letters, they're all trying to advance this storyline that leads from the creation of humanity and humanity's rebellion against God, eventually to a recognition that it's going to take more than even a great human to bring humanity back in sync with God. It's going to take God himself, which brings Jesus onto the scene, and then everything accelerates up and drives us toward a hope of a future, and a future where this creation is healed and changed and recreated. And the ideals that Jesus wants to create in us begin now, but are fulfilled in the future. And so that's the whole story. We talked about that on one of these weeks of this series as well, called the storyline of the Bible. But each of these letters, it fits somewhere into that story. So it's helping to tell the story. Or each lecture that's given, it's going to be in sync with that. And so as we look at those types of things, just a couple things to consider. As we interpret what this part of the Bible means, this lecture, this letter, the interpretation that we give it, what we take from it, should fit, it should agree with the storyline of the whole Bible. If it's opposed to the way that the Bible itself is going, then we probably have a wrong idea about what it means. Also, it's going to refer to parts of the Old Testament, the Hebrew Scriptures, a lot, because most of the people writing these letters are Jewish people. And so they're going to quote some of these laws and some of these principles and pieces of wisdom from Psalms and Proverbs. They're going to quote it a lot, even in these letters in the New Testament. They have that foundation as a person. They're Jewish people referring back to these principles in the Old Testament. They're going to picture Jesus as this exalted king of the universe, because that's who they believe Jesus to be, this Messiah figure, this king who is God with us. They're also going to see the church as God's representatives meant to take this message out to the nations, because as early as Genesis 12, God told Abraham that he eventually would use his family to be a blessing to the nations. And so these letters are portraying the church as exactly that, God's representatives sent out to the world. And then, again, you're going to draw on a lot of different narratives or Old Testament stories and poems and laws. These writers are going to mention that, and they're going to draw principles from those to advise churches in the Roman Empire. So here are these principles from 1,000 years ago in the Old Testament. These principles are still valid, so how do we use that today? Only their today is 2,000 years ago from us, right? Their culture is different. Next is historical context. Most of these lectures and letters, certainly the New Testament ones, they fit between events, and these events are not always talked about in the letters. But if you read some of the Gospels that talk about Jesus' life, or you read the book of Acts, it's going to give you a narrative story, a historical context to plug these different letters into. It'll reference the churches, for example, that some of these letters are written to, so you can figure out where in history, in church history or in Roman history, these things plug in using those books. But it's anywhere from 6 BC up to about 65 AD with these letters in the New Testament. And so that's the historical context. A very different world from the one that we live in today, right? Third thing, literary context. We have to step back and understand how writings happened in the first century. Today, how do you write a letter? You probably don't, right? You get on your computer and you type up an email, you press send, and voila, it's there. And in the first century, things are much more difficult. And so these letters, it's not just like one individual, the Apostle Paul, is sitting down with his quill pen on his paper and he's writing a letter out and then he's just shipping it off somewhere throughout the empire. This is a costly endeavor. A lot of times there are collaborations, and Paul will mention some of his friends, his co-workers that he's writing these letters along with. And so in the first couple sentences of a letter, it'll say Paul along with Timothy or Silvanus or somebody else who's one of his traveling companions. They're working on this together. But all these letters, they have a specific kind of flow of thought. It's an organized, logical flow of thought. And so we'll look into that just a little bit more. First of all, as far as the effort that went into this, a lot of times, again, Paul would be a co-author along with his teammates, and probably as they're traveling, because they did a lot of traveling on foot, you can see them sitting around somebody's house that they're staying in, or maybe they had inns, kind of similar to our hotel concept at that point in time in the Roman world as well. And so maybe he and his traveling companions are sitting around someone's house, in a public room at night with some lamps lighting the room, having a conversation. Maybe they're in one of these more hotel-type situations to the first century along the way somewhere, but they're sitting and they're discussing and dialoguing what they should write, how they should respond to a specific church, perhaps, and the questions that they asked. These ideas are circulating, and at that point in time, they actually had these wax tablets. It would be a wooden frame with wax kind of over that wooden frame, couple-sided, and you could put these together into several frames and kind of flip through them like an ancient notebook. And so people would use that to put their ideas down, but eventually they'd transfer it to either parchment paper, which was made from animal skins, or they would have papyrus, which were scrolls, more like paper-like scrolls made from the papyrus reeds in the Egypt area at that point in time. And so eventually they want to transfer it on to something a little bit more important or a little more durable. But those more durable writing materials were more costly, and so they try to revise and get what they wanted down kind of more precisely. And then what they would do culturally when they were writing letters, and we have hundreds of letters from throughout the Roman Empire to look at, people would hire a professional secretary or a scribe type figure who would write very neatly with very small handwriting. If you read any of these, if you see any of these ancient texts, the handwriting is super tiny and impressively neat, because they would hire professionals to copy out this, to pen the letters, and then even if they were going to make copies of letters that had already been circulated, they would hire professionals to do this. And so the typical process was you would meet with the secretary or the scribe. You'd tell them your ideas, give them your materials and your notes that you'd collected, and then the secretary would leave and write a first draft. And then they would come back and they'd have another meeting, and you'd talk about any corrections or additions or changes you wanted the secretary to make, and you would go back and forth on this process until you were happy with the final draft. And then the final draft would be written on really good, parchment or papyrus paper with really good handwriting. And they were written, again, at great expense. The letters in the New Testament are some of the longest letters that you have in the ancient world, longer than Roman historians' letters. These are extremely long. For example, as far as cost-wise, Romans is the longest letter of Paul that we have in the Bible, and it's a long book, right? To write a letter in the first century, given our kind of current economic weight, if you were to write a letter using that process today, it would be about a $3,000 bill just to have the letter of Romans written one time to send to a church by a secretary or a scribe. And so these were costly endeavors that had processes of revision to make sure that these ideas were really well fleshed out. But it wasn't a cheap thing to do. Then you would hire a private messenger, because the only people that could use the postal service in Rome were the government officials. If you were a government official, they had official means of sending messages and transporting. But there was no post office for the general population. So you would have to hire or ask someone to serve as a messenger to personally carry your letter to whoever it was going to. There would be a specific format. All these ancient letters, they have an opening address. So-and-so greets you, and here's who else is with me. And then there was some kind of a Thanksgiving prayer. And if you were Roman, it was a prayer to one of your local Roman deities or to your emperor, thanking your emperor for good graces. And if it was Paul, it was thanking Jesus, thanking God. Then there's a body of a letter with the main ideas, and finally a conclusion, a closing that often had a final prayer, even if you were Roman and, again, addressing some other deity. That was the form of the letter. And then you'd use these transition words to kind of guide your audience through the logic. And so when you read Paul's letters, for example, he'll use words like since or therefore to show you a relationship between what he's saying now and what he said before. So that shows the same thing. Because, or and now, if he's listing different maybe reasons or pieces of logic. In addition to, maybe something like listen if he's trying to get your attention at first. If-then statements. And so you look at these basically prepositional phrases, these transition words and connecting words, to try to piece together his thoughts. but he has a logical progression of thought because it's not been a quick process of writing this letter. And sometimes I think in some of the letters he'll make quick statements that seem like they're off the cuff, and that was probably a very off the cuff thing that he perhaps said to whoever was writing down the letter, maybe at the final revision, hey, by the way, can you just throw this in there real quick right here? And so some of it comes across that way, but most of it comes across as something that was very intentionally written, very well thought out, where it's not just his off-the-cuff statement. He's not just dictating this off the top of his head. He has thought hard and collaborated on this work that's finally, this letter. And he's saying exactly what he wants to say at this point in time. Also, because rhetoric was the Greek method of presenting thoughts and persuading people at the time, you'll see different rhetoric techniques that appear throughout these letters. For example, one of the techniques was to use past examples to project what's going to happen in the future. So you might see Paul kind of laying a case for what he sees happening based on what he's seen happen in the past. So he'll give you these different events that have happened. And if these have happened, if God has done this, then surely he'll do this in the future. And that was the way it was common to write, again, in this Greek persuasion technique called rhetoric. Or it was common for people in their letters and in their speeches to attack the credibility of opposing views. And you see some of this, right, today in speeches that people give. They'll still use these techniques today. And so it would be pointing out the flaws of an opposing view or establishing why your particular point of view was superior. What does this point of view have to offer that other points of view don't have to offer? And you might see Paul make moves like that in these letters. Or he'll elevate people who are model or exemplary people, or decisions that he considers model or exemplary that people make, even that are really hard given their circumstances, or different values that he thinks are valuable, or a higher set of values than maybe his surrounding culture. And so as you look through these letters, you're going to see elements of the ways people wrote at that point in time in history. You're going to see part of the literary context come to the surface in ways that you might not have seen if you weren't aware of that. But it's going to seem like a first century letter or a first century speech, and it's going to use those kinds of techniques. The last couple of types of context that I want to cover this morning, and this shouldn't be extremely lengthy today, but it's important. Cultural context is the fourth. Again, these letters and these lectures, they're advising people who are living in Greco-Roman culture, which is not 21st century American culture. It's very different. And so they're going to assume a few things that are probably very different from the world that you woke up in this morning. First, they're going to assume that they're in a polytheistic society. Most people in society believe there are many, many gods. Many temples, many gods that control everything from, the weather to farming to war and all this. And most people just think there are many, many gods over very different things, all around the world, or that the emperor is God. Very, very polytheistic society. And in our world, our Western world today, most people are monotheists, or they're atheists, right? They either don't believe in a God, or they believe in some kind of a God, but not in, 20 or 30 or 1,000 or 5,000 different gods and goddesses doing different things. So when you read things, you're going to find mentions of idols, of statues to different deities all over the place, just a whole different world. Second thing, they're going to assume that there's a social hierarchy. And maybe you can see elements of this certainly in systems like caste systems today in the world. But in America, we largely are kind of, I would say, spared from a lot of this type of social hierarchy, at least as it was present at this point in time in Rome. And so here's the hierarchy. If you're the emperor of Rome, you're at the top of the pyramid, right? And if you're one of the very, very few governing officials that are closely affiliated with the emperor, maybe a senator or some major regional figure, you're also at the top of the pyramid. And the top of the pyramid is extremely narrow, but it's where all the power is concentrated. And then as you move down and you broaden out, if you're a regional government official or a local official or a priest at one of these different temples for one of the many gods around, you kind of have a leg up in society. You have a little bit more honor, maybe a little bit more position. If you're a merchant in society and you're just a self-made person, or somehow you find yourself in a very wealthy position, you don't have the influence of somebody in the governing realm, but you're doing well in this society, and you're still kind of at the top. And then everything broadens out vastly from there. If you're a slave, If you're just a day laborer working a job to get some money to survive, to make it to the next day, you're the working poor, you're most of society. 85 to 90% of society at this point is just trying to survive another day. That's the reality. And while it seems like many of us maybe in the United States today are just barely trying to survive, not at this level. I mean, think about you're making maybe $15,000 to $20,000 a year as a family, trying to just put food on the table, trying to make the rent payment. Everything's stressful all the time. This is 85 or 90% of the Roman world. And 85 to 90% of the local churches that you're seeing Paul speak into at this point in time in history. So a very different world. And then if you're a widow, or you're an orphan, or you're a beggar, or you have a disability, you're at the bottom. And you're at risk of dying on a daily basis. You're at the bottom of society. And that's how it works. Second thing, men are always above women and children in the ancient world. That's part of the hierarchy. So if you're born a man, you already have a little bit of privileged position. If you're a woman or you're a child, you have no power, regardless of who you are, for the most part. Finally, if you're a Roman citizen, you have an advantage. If you're a non-citizen, or you've been freed from slavery, or you're currently enslaved, then you're at the bottom, and you have no power. And that's the way the world works. So when you see advice given in the New Testament, it's going to assume this social hierarchy is in place, and there's nothing that we can do to completely break that, because it's controlled by the very few at the top who are in positions of power in the Roman world, and there's really nothing we can do to change that. We can't revolt against the Roman army. They just come and they crush you. And so there's concessions that are given, and there's operation within that hierarchy, even though it's not ideal. Last thing, it's an honor-shame culture, which is very different from our culture that we experience here as well. Maybe some of you grew up in elements of that, but you'd almost have to go to Eastern cultures today, perhaps to China or India or something, to find something that operated in this way as an honor-shame culture, in the same way that it does in the Bible. And so just a couple of things with honor-shame cultures. The group or the family is going to be more important than the individual always. And so it's not about you. In America, it's about you. If you watch a Disney movie, it's about you and your hopes and your dreams and everything you dream of, and who cares what anybody else thinks. It's all about you and your happiness. In an honor-shame culture, it is not about you. Your happiness doesn't really matter. It's the group that matters. So we have to rewire the way we think to understand this type of culture. Also, the group or the family's value determines the individual's value. So if you're part of a group, let's say a church, or you're a part of a family that's not at the top of society, that's at the bottom of society, then that determines your value as an individual. The group determines your value. Also, the group or the family's value, it's decided not by you or your family, but by society, by people around you. And it might be based on your wealth. In fact, it would be. It'd be based on your wealth, your education, your rhetorical skills, your family pedigree, your political connections, and kind of where you fit into that social pyramid hierarchy. That determines how valuable you are. And your value, it's always changing. And so people that live in more Eastern cultures today, this is the way that society operates for them. Their value, it's never solid. It can change at any point in time. And you can strive to gain honor, which is why you might find people in Eastern cultures putting a high importance on what career choice people make and how much money people in their family make. Because as they advance in society and society's honor, it brings honor to their entire family and standing to their entire family. And so those things that help you get a leg up, that help your family gain honor, they are highly pushed and highly emphasized. It's not about that job you love that pays next to nothing. It's about bringing honor to your family. So do what's necessary to get honor for our family. But on the converse, one person, it just takes one person to bring shame to your entire group or your entire family, or in the New Testament, to your entire church. So perhaps, let's just say hypothetically, someone in this congregation, in our church community, they make maybe a poor decision, and it's something that society as a whole frowns on. They end up on the arrests page, and just something that really like brings the ire of our whole city, right? For the most part, people will isolate that. And while people may say, well, they went to church at this church, it's probably not going to bring things down. Maybe if I, as the pastor, drew the ire of all of society, that would fall on me. But for the most part, if you do something, maybe it'll disgrace you. Maybe it might bring a little disgrace on your family. People could connect it with your church, but it probably in large part won't matter because we consider it individual, right? You made your choice. Your mom didn't make that choice. Your dad didn't make that choice. Your siblings or your kids didn't make the choice. You made the choice. So it's your problem, not so in honor shame society. And so if one person does something extremely revolting in the culture, the church has to process, well, how do we deal with this? Because if that one person loses honor for our church, everybody in society is going to disassociate from us. So the stakes are higher. So even how they respond to different discipline situations within the church, they're all based on this very different honor-shame culture. And so we have to understand those things reading the Bible, because some of the advice and some of the solutions, they operate within those realities, that everyone around you believes in many, many gods and goddesses. Everyone around you's station in life is pretty much settled. And everyone around you is trying to gain honor and avoid shame at all costs. And so some of the discussion and the solutions and the advice, they operate within those realities, which may or may not be realities for us today. So maybe taking everything and just importing it into 21st century America doesn't always work because our culture operates very differently. Final thing I want to talk about this morning is situations, situational context. All of these speeches or sermons or lectures that are given in the New Testament, they fall into a specific storyline, right? So they're all given for a reason. And the letters specifically are addressing some very unique circumstances. Most of them are in response to churches' questions. Churches sent a letter to Paul or to Peter or to John, or Paul or Peter or John or Timothy or someone heard about some incidents happening through some friends that were traveling, some problems in a church, and so they're writing back to give their advice to these different, specific, very unique circumstances. And so as we look at these letters, we have to realize that. Because Paul, for example, is going to suggest culturally relevant responses to specific challenges at a specific local church or regional area in first century Rome. He's not going to tell us necessarily thinking about what the church will think when they read this letter 2,000 years later. He's just sending a piece of mail to respond to some specific questions on behalf of one church at one place in the Roman Empire. And yes, the culture is unique, but the very specific local situation is also something that's unique. Local challenges in first century Rome for churches. So these letters, they only give you part of the conversation. They give you clues to reconstruct what the rest of the situation is. But we can't do that like definitively, right, with absolute certainty. So we have to listen to what Paul's saying. And we look at these statements and we say, well, why would Paul have to say something like that? I wonder what the story is. And you have to think backwards. Oh, if Paul is saying something like this, I wonder if a situation like this was happening. Why would he need to say something like that? It must be because something like this was happening, or at least it could be. And so maybe there was some opposition that was happening, and Paul needed to address it. And opposition could take a lot of different forms, right? Spiritual, it could be Jews in the area that were trying to tell the church they needed to abide by all of the laws in the Old Testament and live the life as if they were Jews. It could be Roman people who were looking on Christians in disdain because they felt like Christians had a different emperor or a king named Jesus instead of Caesar, so all kinds of things. It could be in response to some questions that were made. Perhaps questions something like this. In fact, in some of the letters, you get the idea that Paul got a question, and maybe his question was, should we all eat at the same table? Because again, in the first century, society was so divided, and you didn't eat with people who weren't of your same social rank. Somebody who was in the governing class would have never had a meal around the table with a slave. Yet in the church, because of Jesus and the complete way that he just reframes people's thinking about humanity, every human is a valuable person made in God's image, so they're all kind of equally valuable in that sense. This is revolutionary. And so in the church, you see people who are officials dining at tables with slaves. And this is just something that's unheard of. But in the beginning, those questions would have come about. Should we eat at a table with somebody who's not a Jew and doesn't adhere to kosher diet? Should we eat at a table with somebody who's a slave? I mean, we're an official in Ephesus. Like, how incredibly degrading to do that. Should we really do that? So you have to reconstruct possibilities in that sense. Should we share our wealth? Because some of us, we're wealthy merchants and other people are widows or beggars or disabled and they can't even survive. How do we navigate that? Should we free the slaves? Right? Because now that there's this equality around the table, what if we own a ton of slaves, a ton of people? How should we operate within that? How should we treat them? And so you see these letters, they speak into that, and you can infer that those questions have been asked. And sometimes the answers are disturbing, because in our society we would say, yes, free them at all costs. But that's simply not possible in the Roman Empire, because there's this social hierarchy, and it's not determined by a local church. It's determined by the Empire of Rome and the emperor. And if you just buck the system overnight, you just get killed. They send some Roman soldiers your way, and you're up on a cross the next morning, and they could care less. And so there's a lot of tricky, challenging questions that these apostles are helping the church navigate. And they're not the answers always that we would have and we would ideally want in our society today. Should we give women authority in the church? That's something that comes up. And there are different answers at different places to different churches in regards to that question. Because again, in society, there are men, then there are women and children. And authority is not permissible for women and children in society at that point in time. Should we remove somebody from our group because they're shaming our church's reputation? Again, these are totally different issues, but you kind of get the idea that that was the question that was asked. Should we eat meat that's been offered to these different idols, these other gods that many people worship around us, or is that bad? And so based on Paul's statements, or Peter's statements, or John's statements, you kind of track it back, and you have to do a little bit of detective work and a little bit of almost educated guesswork. What kinds of questions were asked in the first conversation or the first letter that this letter that we have is responding to, right? Because you only get part of the conversation, so you have to try to reconstruct it with clues. It's a little tricky to understand this part of the New Testament, but it's kind of fun to put those pieces together as well. And what you're going to find is that whoever's writing these letters, they pull pieces of wisdom, oftentimes from other places in the Old Testament, and they'll make suggestions based on those pieces of wisdom. So they may flesh it out in the first couple of chapters of a letter, and then the second half, they're saying, well, here was the wisdom that we've kind of deciphered, we feel like, from God, and here's how we would suggest applying it to your current situation. Again, in first century Rome. And each of those situations in each of the churches were just slightly different. Sometimes there's a problem that people are responding to. Sometimes there's a concern. And all these letters address those kinds of things, and we're gathering clues. And ultimately, they're providing solutions for specific churches. And so the question then that follows, right, is should we apply the same solutions today? And this is where it gets even harder. Because so across the realm of Christianity today, if you go to different denominations of Christian churches, they're going to be somewhere on this spectrum of apply everything exactly as it's stated in the New Testament. All the solutions that were given to these New Testament churches, you should apply directly today to your church. So I guess the opposite extreme would be none of this matters. We can't learn anything from this because this was an ancient culture. And perhaps the best place to land is somewhere in the middle, because we have to, on the one hand, understand these were written into specific situations, into a specific culture. But some of the principles that were used might be principles that are very relevant for us today. And in some cases, maybe the solutions are even great solutions for today. But in other cases, maybe the solutions are not great today. Maybe our society is at a different place that allows us more ideal solutions. Like, for example, not having slaves, or not allowing slavery in our society today. We have that luxury where it wasn't present in ancient Rome. And so on those passages that deal with slavery, maybe the way that we apply those principles today, we have even more freedom, and we can give people more value than they were limited with in the first century. And so maybe with these kinds of questions, as we read our New Testament, we should ask things like, is this statement that's made to this church in this place, well, one, is it made widely throughout the Bible? Is this suggested to other people in other times, other cultural backgrounds, or is it just suggested to this church right here? Is this something that's talked about frequently in the Bible? Or is this a statement where maybe I have one or two occurrences or suggestions of this piece of advice, but it's nowhere else in Scripture? Or is this piece of advice that's given, is it consistent with something throughout the Bible? For example, with authority given to women. What do I see throughout the Bible of authority being given to women? Is restricting, women from teaching something that's even consistent throughout the Bible itself? Or is it something that's more isolated to the specific church, given the culture that it exists in the scenario, the specific situation that it exists in? And these are questions that we have to weigh and we have to consider as we read the New Testament. Perspectives about slavery, perspectives about leadership. And then finally, are these statements, are they made ideally, or are they just cultural concessions? For example, there are statements that are made to slave owners about how they treat their slaves, and statements in these New Testament letters that are made to slaves about how they interact with their owners. Is that an ideal situation for either? Looking from 21st century America, I would say not really, not at all, right? That's not ideal. And so, are these statements made ideally, or are they cultural concessions? Are they helping people one step closer to treating people with the value that they were intended to have when they were created, when God made humanity in His image? Is it bringing them a little closer? Because sometimes you see the Bible doing that. Or is it something that's really leading them up to the ideal, And so it makes it a little more complicated. The way that I would summarize this finally is letters in the New Testament, they give us a process for navigating challenges, because we can go through a similar process of trying to apply pieces of wisdom and advice from the Bible to our current situation. They also give us some valuable wisdom for thinking about different issues that we face today. But if you take everything as a precedent, because this happened in the past this way, it needs to come and play out exactly the same way in the future, you'll find yourself having to justify slavery and other things that will be very uncomfortable. If you find everything as a prescription, this is the way that God wants everything to play out today in our culture, that will also be hard. You'll hit a lot of conflicted interests throughout the Bible. And so we get wisdom and we get a process, but taking those same things and applying them today also takes prayer and consideration of the entire picture of the Bible and wisdom throughout the Bible, and maybe from the Holy Spirit, given our specific circumstances in our day, because they're different even at past times in the Bible. And so we get wisdom, but trying to apply everything exactly across the board as it appears will give us a lot of conflict, right? Even with who God is and who people are. And so all that to say, it's complicated. And so we need to know there's layers of context, right, as we read the Bible. Otherwise, we'll wonder, we'll draw wrong conclusions about who God is and what His heart is for people, and even maybe what He wants for us. And so as you read the New Testament letters and some of the lectures that are given, keep those things in the back of your mind, because everything might not be exactly as it seems as we try to apply it today.